Hello, my name is Carlos. I'm a part of the Vue core team, and today I want to talk about the define component. Let's go a deep dive on the types. And define component is the function that we use to declare Vue components, and there it's where all the magic of typing first happens in Vue when you're declaring a component. So the Vue 3 is built with TypeScript. Vue 2 was built with Flow, mainly we just type annotations with Flow, but like JavaScript, and but it's only for now because there's a PR to add TypeScript and it should be merged soon because that's almost ready to be merged. So let's talk about what is a Vue component. So this is from the docs. It's just like we declare components. We can split the UI into reusable pieces of code. You can test components, etc. So mainly what we use to define it is just like define component, and it comes some stuff into it because in terms of TypeScript, it depends on the context. So we can have like component options, which are not options API. These are just like how you declare the options. So you can see it here that this is just a simple component. And so we need to have the type for that component. And we also need to have the render component. And the render component is just when you use it on the template or with the age, that's when you render. And you can just use that as a render component. And then we have a public instance. And the public instance is just basically when you access the ref or access.this, that's the public instance. So on the options, we have a few things that changes the define component overloads. So define component overloads, it has 4 main overloads, and the 4 main ones are the function component, no properties component, and array declaration props, and object props. So we have those 4 overloads, and those are the main ones. So those are used in Options API, Composition API, Functions API, and also Class API. But Class API is what's plugin, so it's not natively supported by define component, but it's extended. Render component, it's basically what we use on the template, and we can define the component and just render component. So in this case, I'm using H, but we could be using the TSX syntax. That would be similar. So in these cases, so you can see the code on top of it. So this is expected to throw an error because we declare foo as a number and we're just passing as a string. So expect an error those there. So a sneak peek on what we're going to talk like later on this talk. We can see that we can create like a fake component, and we can create by using just props, and that's just basically the fake render component for Vue. Just using that, and these are valid. So you can see that string expects an error or no props expects an error, but without with a number, it works fine. So this is our render component, and then we have public instance. And the public instance is basically you define your component, you define the props, and you have this.a, and this is the public instance of the component. You can also use it as in the composition API by get current instance and then proxy, or in the template ref by using ref. On the define component, so these are the overloads that we have. This is just simple implementation of them, and basically those are the main overloads, and all of them they return a define component. And define component, functional component. So this is basically the function that we use on the functional component. So the on the right, it's basically I cut some generics out, but it's basically this is actually the JavaScript TypeScript implementation of it. So the generics, so we have the prop types and the raw bindings there, and those are just the generics for us to get the props. And then we have the actual render function, the setup. It can either return raw bindings or a render function. If and this is what it returns, just returns a defined component, props, and raw bindings. So defined components doing quite a heavy lifting here, and all the defined component, they will return a defined component, and that defined component is just a helper class to have like everything in there, basically. Just to have the render component, the proxy, and the options on one single component. So when we want to use the composition API and the options API, they use the same overloads because they are meant to be used like in conjunction. So there's no overload for those. So what drives the overloads are actually just the props mainly. The components, they use the options base, and the components option base uses legacy options. So this is basically just focused on the options API specifically, but not only, but mainly just to keep it simple. And these are the generics, yeah, props, D, C, M. So this is basically what we have in the code. I omitted some of this code to just make it to fit in this slide, but this should be basically what it is. And we're gonna go through the generics to see what it is. So the first one is gonna be props. And props, they're gonna be used in the data. The code for the implementation of the argument on the data is quite long. So I'm not sure, I'm omitting it here, but it should basically here. It also returns a D, and the D is just also known as data, and that's what returns by data. And then we have computed, and computed is just computed options, and computed options is just a record of strings and valid read or writable computed functions. And then we have methods, also it's just like a record of string and functions. And then we have mixins. Mixins is a bit more complex. I'm not going to go through them. There's an actual, you should check the PR, it's actually quite complex implementation, because mixins, they must like fall through all the parents' options to the children, and that adds quite a lot. And the mixin is an array here to have the type or on the type, so we can extract that. So the extend is basically the same thing, just not an array, it's just one specific type. And then we have others, and these are the watch, provide, inject, or custom options for plugins. So these are all the options. So component options, and the component options, we have three options types, and we have without props, with array props, and with objects. So and each one of them, the props is, that's the only difference. So here it's options, and we set here that these types to void. Here is just an array of prop names, and here props must be undefined or undeclared. And here are the overloads that I mentioned. So as well, I'm omitting the generics here. So the define component, this is for the function, so or direct setup function component. And implementation is very simple. And here we not no props, we call the options without props. And here with the array props, object props, and the actual implementation of it. And you can see that it's just this. This is the actual implementation on the code of define component. So define component, this is just a trigger for the TypeScript to be able to infer the proper types in there. So now let's tackle on the define component type. And this is basically the type that's going to hold everything together when you use define component. And it contains the public instance constructor. And the public instance constructor will have the render component and the proxy there as well. And we also have props there, components of base, and public props. Public props are shared across everything. So you can see here, so this is render component, an instance component, options, and public props. vnode props, allow component props, and component custom props. So we have everything in there here. And then we have the usage. So let's use it. So this is using the script setup. Just adds less boilerplate code here, and we can just see we import our component, and then we access our component options with myComponent.props. So currently is not fully typed correctly yet, but there's a PR already for it to be merged, and you can see the PR at the bottom. Then you can access the instance type. So instance is just a return type. You can just use type of my component. We will probably provide like a sugar for this. It's just we still need to find out a good name for it. And we also have the instance component. So after we get the instance type, we can just use that as a ref. And a ref can be null as well. So that is also something to bear in mind. And then we have the render component here. So the testing type. So we can use TSX or H to test types. And the TSX will allow you greater control and the better errors. And that's why Volver and TSX, they use both TSX. On using H, you can get errors, but it's a bit more cryptic. You don't really understand because the overloads are not really easy to debug. So if the types are if there is an error, it's going to be much trickier to find out what's causing the error. Let's play around with a defined component now that we went through all of it, and let's see if we can do some nice things. That imagine that we are building a library, and we don't want to declare all the props. We just want to handle like as an attribute, because props, they have like a runtime validation, but we don't want that. We just want like known attributes that we can use. So let's do that. So let's create a function called augment component props. And T extends a defined component. Define component must have the any at least. And because the default defined component without any argument, they default to a component without any props. And that's when you're trying to infer, it's going to cause some problems. So after that, we have T, and the first argument is going to be T. It's going to be must be defining component. You can also use component here. It's sort of going to be a similar behavior, but it might not work as good. So, and we're going to return T and new of prop known attributes. So we're going to say that props will also have known attributes, and that would extend the component. And then we can define a component with augment props. We just define the components, which just for testing, just test number. So define the component inside, you don't have access to the attributes types here. So bear in mind that implementation of the defined component would not have those types. But aside from that, what the users will see, they will see the known attributes there. So you can see that the first line comp test is working, so it does work. And the second line, we try to pass special as a string, it does not work. And the third line, we pass test as a string, it should be a number, so it also doesn't work. So so this is just really simple example that we can just use. And now let's do level up with generics. So generics, they don't work like super nicely yet, because there's some work that needs to be done, because we need to bypass some prop validations. And one thing is, if we have the props declare on the code, if we use this method, it won't be really get the inferred generic. It should sort of work if you don't have props, but as soon as you have props with the same name, it might cause some issues. So bear in mind that. So one solution would probably just remove the props declaration from the type and just override it with generic type props, for example. So it's still work in progress. There's still RFC just for us to get ideas on how we can implement this. I see it in the setup. It's going to be much better experience because we can do some manipulation. So it's going to be nice. But let's see. So let's explain this code then. So one of the requirements for generics is to have a constructor. That's a requirement, and the constructor must be inferred at the TSX level. And TSX also requires a constructor there, so it's fine. And in Vue, it's already declared that the TSX props are infer with $sign props. So we need to create like a class, and we just return props, and then we have like properties there. And this can be generic. So here in this case, I just declared class, and I declared the class because of, I mean, this way there's no code in JavaScript. It's just purely type, and that's what we want. We don't want this to have like a weight on our components, because this is just TypeScript, and you don't want that to be at runtime. If you want that to be at runtime, you can just pass us in the props if you really want to, but we don't need this for now, at least. So yeah, we have the value must be t. On change is an event, and the events in Vue can also be properties. They are basically the same. You can pass on change, and that's gonna pass an event. So we can use that as well. So here we're taking that advantage, but we could possibly use declare emit, and then with that we can just also infer some properties. So under $sign and our property, those are like Vue properties, Vue keys. So we can just, those are the ones that we rely when we're building types. So in this case, we just need props. That's what the render component needs. So that's what we're gonna use. So yeah, as soon as we have that, so we can just, it's basically the same thing, but with classes, it's a bit more, it's a bit different. So because the generic props, they must be the a class, and you need to pass them. But there's a, like in TypeScript, you cannot. There's like a limitation that you cannot pass partial generics. So that means that imagine that the augment component props function, it has two generics. First generic would be the class that we're gonna use, and the other one is the inferred one, inferred define component. It won't work because we need to pass as like an argument, but we can infer as an argument, but we cannot pass directly as a generic. So this is like a limitation, and you can circumvent that by creating another function. Also explained on PR. So if you go to the to RFCs, you can see the generic class component there, and it's, if you could provide like a good like your idea on how to use it, any feedback, it's very, very welcome, just for us to improve this. So yeah, so after we have our component, we augment component props, and then we can use it. So, and on the first one, value is going to be a number, and unchange is also a number. And component value, so on the second one, component value, it's going to be an object with a1. So on unchange, we're trying to do object plus 1, and that doesn't work because it's an object. So yeah, so this is the explanation. That's all for me today. So you can see the code available on the repo. You can see the presentation and everything. So I hope you guys enjoyed. Any questions, just hit me up on the Q&A section. And yeah, thank you very much.